I've talked about it before on this channel, but authoritarian states, dictators, and horror don't mix. During the Nazi regime, they did 0 horror movies. Before the Nazis, Germany was doing all kinds of amazing horror. I've mentioned some of them in earlier film sessions. But when the Nazis took over, no more horror. Under fascist Italy, there was no horror. Now, in 1956, after they had been recovering from fascism for about 12 years, they started to do horror again. The first one was I Vampiri, which means the vampires, and it's not really about a vampire. I mean, it is, but it's science, not magic. Later on, we had Mario Bava come into play, and he started doing movies like Black Sunday. Actually, he was involved in I Vampiri as well. He was a cinematographer. Kaltiki and other scary things. One of the fun features about Italian horror is that during the fascist regime, pretty much the scariest thing that any Italian had ever seen was the Disney movie Snow White, with the scary race through the forest with the scary trees. So here's an image of Black Sunday next to Snow White, and you can see the scary trees and apparently scary trees. I've seen earlier Italian horror, and scary trees figure prominently in a lot of Italian horror because that's what they had to work with under the fascists. The Soviet Union, also not just authoritarian, totalitarian, only produced 1 horror movie in all its 69 years of existence, V. And V got kind of snuck in because it's technically a fairy tale by Gogol, so I guess they didn't think of it as a horror movie, but it is worth watching. Now, Brazil was taken over by a military junta in 1964, which is the year that Coffin Joe's first movie appeared. At Midnight I Take Your Soul. Probably it was actually produced during the previous regime, which is democratic, and maybe it got grandfathered in because another Coffin Joe movie managed to appear in 1967, but then there was basically no more actual horror movies in Brazil until after the junta left. Mainland China, also totalitarian, didn't have any horror until after they annexed Hong Kong, which had a huge tradition of horror. Luckily, China is still creating horror. I guess their totalitarian regime is a lot less totalitarian than they used to be, but they are making horror at a reduced rate. Still, some Chinese horror. There is one shining exception to all of this about dictators hating horror, and that is Francoist Spain. Now, I'm not saying that the Caudillo had anything to do with encouraging horror movies, but for some reason, horror wasn't actively suppressed in Spain, as it was in basically every other authoritarian regime. Now, this doesn't mean that Spain has the huge tradition of horror. They have less horror than Italy or Mexico, but they do have some, and their horror is kind of interesting in my opinion, so we're going to discuss it. Oh, yeah, and my source book, Sandy Petersen's Los Mitos de Cthulhu para 5e, is out in Spanish from Edge. If you speak Espanol or have a gaming friend who does, point them at it because it's available. 400 pages of really good Cthulhu stuff for D&D. Anyway, I've already done a video about Armand de Osorio, who made the Blind Dead movies, as well as some other. Made a movie about a witch. He made a hilarious movie about a sea serpent, which I love. But we also have the greatness that is, drum roll please, Paul Naschy. Now, Paul Naschy was a bodybuilder, so he's pretty buff, and he's not super tall, he's just, buff. And he got into making horror movies, and his idea was that he would make a movie where he was a werewolf, and he really liked the idea of werewolves. He got it all set to go, it was going to be his werewolf, and here's what the government did weigh in at this point, and I don't know, some censor said, your werewolf can't be Spanish. I'm not sure why. He has to be Polish, because I guess Spaniards are too good to be werewolves? That can't be it, because there are Spanish who become werewolves in the movies. Just the main guy, Waldemar Daniński, is Paul Naschy's werewolf, and so we have a Polish werewolf in Spanish movies. But he made a lot of these movies. And they're kind of weird looking because he's like a Wolfman type werewolf with like the flat face and the hair all around, very much Lon Chaney type makeup, but they're gory. I mean, he rips into you with his claws and there's blood pouring out of his mouth, and he's a gory Lon Chaney werewolf. Also, there's a lot of nudity for those who like that, so be warned. Well, not, full frontal or anything, but there's boobs and stuff. Anyway, Paul Naschy was most famous for his Waldemar Daninsky werewolf movies, and he did a lot of other movies as well, and plays all kinds of weird characters. He was a hunchback, a vampire. He has a movie where there's a post-Holocaust world where most everyone went blind. He's a serial killer with a brain transplant. There's a hunchback with an acid bath, and he even played Mr. Hyde, though he combined it with the werewolf thing. So he's fun to look at. He kept making films later in life. He did a movie called School Killer, which I like quite a bit. It's more recent. There was also some Italian-Spanish co-productions that led to some good films. There's All the Colors of the Dark. There's one of my very favorites, Breakfast at the Manchester Morgue. We'll get into that later on in another video and talk about zombie movies. But eventually, Franco died, and Spain worked back to a constitutional monarchy. Now, when Italy threw off fascism, it took them 12 years before they got their first real horror movie back. But since Spain already had horror, even if in limited numbers, they were able to keep doing horror films right along. They didn't have to have this delay. And so we have examples of some more recent Spanish horror. Now, Spanish doesn't have a huge horror film industry. It doesn't really have distinctive genres like we do in America or Italy or China, but it does have some fun shows. So I'm going to talk about some of these movies. So the first one here is called The Ugliest Woman in the World. And it's part science gone wrong, and it's part a female empowerment film, seriously. And it's partly a serial killer mystery. Someone's murdering the beautiful women, and it is in fact the ugliest woman in the world. So that's kind of fun. Sorry about that. Let's move on to Thesis. Thesis, which means thesis, is in fact my favorite movie about snuff films I've ever seen. I really like it, and I think you will too. It's got a lot of really strong moments, as you'd expect. It's not about making the snuff films. It's not like a gore movie. It's just this woman who finds out in her film class that there is someone actually making a snuff movie. And part of the idea behind it is unlike most movies about that, is that in real life, as you may know, snuff films basically don't exist. There isn't an industry for making them. So when she finds out there might be one, it's like a big deal to try to track down who's doing it, what's going on. There's a university. There's this creepy guy who really likes terrible horror movies. Maybe he's the snuff guy, but it doesn't seem to be. Anyway, it moves on. It's a lot of fun. One of my son's favorite movies is Witching and Bitching, which I really hate the title. I'm going to hold it up to the Spanish, not understanding English very well. But this is a pretty good movie. It's got a lot of humor, and it is about witches. And the witches are pretty good, and they're very traditional witches to the point that they want to bake babies in the oven, that kind of thing. So I liked it quite a bit. I don't go much more into it, except that if you like movies about witches, you don't mind a little humor in your stuff, that's not a bad choice. There is Wreck, possibly the best zombie movie in the last 20, 30 years. It was tragically redone in English with Americans. I like the Spanish version better. It's almost shot for shot. So I guess if you see the American one, you're not losing everything. But the original Wreck is really, really good. I saw it before the American version came out. I'm glad I did. And they have a sequel, which is, of course, named Wreck 2. Now, the sequel is cool because what they do, they start it when the ending of the first Wreck, like, you should. And the problem with the sequel is in an original movie where there's a lot of mystery going on. What's the cause of the zombie outbreak? What is this mysterious Satanist stuff? Why is there science involved? They had to actually go in and explain some of that backstory, which you're forced to do in a sequel. So they do, but they do a pretty good job. It's still not as good as the original, but I thought they did a great job of explaining what's going on in Wreck and keeping a lot of the mystery still. One of the scenes that my son really likes is there's a point where there's an object in this upstairs room that you can't see that doesn't exist when the lights are on. So they have to turn the lights off, then use night vision to see it. Then when the lights go on, it's gone again. So that's kind of fun. One of my very favorite movies I've ever seen, and it's not a movie I plan to watch a lot of times, is called Who Can Kill a Child, which is about an island in the Mediterranean where something has gone wrong with the children. And this is really scary, I thought, and really impressive for any adult to watch, especially if you have kids. So Who Can Kill a Child? I recommend watching it. I predict you will not want to watch it again immediately because it's so strong. So there it is. And they made many more. So Spain has a lot of horror movies. Look into it. Find some out. And let's not forget that Lovecraft's most filmed story, Cool Air, features Dr. Munoz, who is, of course, Spanish. So keep it up and Viva España!